I'm a little shorter than the previous speakers. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullah.
And it is an honor to be with you here during this month of Muharram. Thank you, my dear brother Robert, for organizing the series, for including me, and for that introduction. I am truly touched by it. Thank you, Brother Ali and your family, for all of your tireless work in making this happen. And thank you also, Brother, for the beautiful land acknowledgement that you began us with, reminding us, as we should always be reminded, that as we are talking about the colonial violence in Gaza, we are standing on ground that is permeated with the blood of the colonial violence. Land that is the land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and across this country that currently calls itself Canada, land that continues to see the ongoing criminalization and violent subjugation of Indigenous land and water defenders, the continuation of a genocide that set precedents for the genocide that we see unfolding in Gaza and across Palestine right now. So thank you to both Brother Robert and Brother Ali for all of that. I know, speaking to this audience, I don't need to tell you about the horrors that are happening in Gaza, to recite the usual litany of facts and statistics and figures that we constantly reiterate in a desperate attempt to get Canadian politicians and people in power to care, if not about Palestinian life, then perhaps to care even a little bit about the legal consequences they may face for being complicit in an overt genocide. But for those of us who are in this room here today, we know that even as our bodies may be here in this land that currently calls itself Canada, for the last 9 months, our hearts and our minds and our consciousness have been with the people of Gaza, enduring and undergoing this genocide. Gaza, where even after not one, but 3 international Court of Justice decisions ordering Israel to halt its genocidal actions, is still the site of one of the most concentrated rates of killing in the world and most concentrated sites of starvation in the world. So just a few days ago, UN experts issued yet another statement about famine in Gaza, warning that famine had now spread to the entire territory, enumerating and describing the cases of the children who are perishing because they have nothing to eat and nothing to drink. Gaza, where even just a few weeks into the genocide had already been the site of bombardment many times more powerful than the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima. Who knows now how many times more since then that munitions load has increased? No one is even bothering anymore to keep track. Gaza, where the UN Environmental Program has told us is the site of 13 times more rubble than from all other world conflicts combined since 2008. Imagine, concentrated in this tiny territory, 13 times more rubble than from all other conflicts combined since 2008, under which we know, according to the Lancet, approximately 10,000 people remain buried, slowly suffocating to death or decomposing under the ruins. Gaza's entire architecture of life, their homes, their mosques, their churches, their museums, turned into detritus and mass graves. Gaza, which is not only the home now of the most children killed in the world in any conflict. In just 4 months, more children killed than in all conflicts combined in 4 years across the entire world. Not only the site of most children killed in any conflict, but now also the largest population of amputated children anywhere in the world. Just yesterday, The Guardian reported that Israel has been using unprecedented weapons that are specifically loaded with shrapnel that explode upon entering the body, weapons that are particularly dangerous and detrimental to children whose organs and vessels are so small and compacted. I see that we have children here in the audience today, alhamdulillah, and so I won't go into the extremely disturbing and graphic details of what The Guardian reported in their piece and what has been reported in other accounts of the violence against children, the unprecedented violence against children in Gaza. But I will just say that violence against children is often represented as apolitical, simply a humanitarian tragedy. But in fact, there is nothing more political than violence against children, because what violence against children does in advancing genocidal aims is not simply destroying people as they exist right now, but it is destroying the future, both at the individual level of the children's lives destroyed and the collective life of the community as a whole. Which is why, from every settler colonial project, from the residential school in Kamloops to the killing fields of Khan Yunis, violence against children has been a central pillar of the genocidal attempt. There are now so many children who have been maimed and orphaned simultaneously in Gaza that a new medical acronym, WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family, has had to be coined by doctors and humanitarian workers in the region. A fact that was well publicized by South Africa in their case at the International Court of Justice against Israel's genocide. WCNSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family, joins all of the other new words that have had to be coined to describe the types of violence that Israel has been unleashing in Gaza. For example, scholasticide, the destruction of education and institutions of knowledge, so that currently every single university in Gaza has been destroyed and 90% of schools have been damaged or bombed. Just the other day, Al Jazeera showing video of a school that had been bombed, children playing football in front of the school, yelling, "Strike, strike," as the bomb descended upon them in their play. Scholasticide, obstetric violence, another term coined by the former UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism to describe the targeted assault on pregnant and birthing women and girls in Gaza, denial of basic medical equipment, forcing them to give birth under conditions that no woman should ever have to labor under. All of these new terms, wounded child, no surviving family, scholasticide, obstetric violence, they all speak deeply to the particularly genocidal nature of Israel's project in Gaza, which is not simply about inflicting destruction in the present, but about destroying the possibilities for future life, a futuricide. The reason why so many new terms have had to be invented to describe what is happening in Gaza is because we lack even the most basic legal words and concepts and framework in order to be able to apprehend it. The word genocide in international law, for example, is not adequate precisely because it was restrictively defined to refer only to certain acts of mass destruction of humans in order to protect colonial forms of violence from consequence and accountability. Ecocide, the mass destruction of the environment, not simply the unbalancing of the mizan, but the total obliteration of the mizan, the ecological system that supports and sustains all human and other than human life in Gaza. The ecocide that is happening in Gaza, such that the emissions from the cargo flights that have been required to transport tens of thousands of tons of weapons from the US to Israel alone have emitted more carbon emissions in just those flights than the total annual carbon emissions from some small global south countries as a whole. This ecocide that is unfolding in Gaza, ecocide is not an independent crime in international law. Again, in order to protect colonial forms of violence that were built on the destruction of the entire environmental life support system for the colonized to protect this from consequence and accountability. When it comes to the mass killing of children, which I've described before, the mass targeted killing of children, there is no word for this in international law at all, at least not that I'm aware of. The absence of these words is not an accident or an aberration or a mere oversight. Rather, it has been built into a colonial international legal system that was developed by colonial powers in order to maintain and sustain and obscure colonial violence from view. Often we describe the erasure of words as Orwellian, as a means of sustaining domineering state power. But how much more Orwellian to have never even have had the words to describe these violences in the first place at all. And so what is happening in Gaza is not simply a genocide according to the restrictive international legal definition. It is not simply or only a genocide. Rather, it is what we might call a holocide, from the Greek words for total and destruction. A holocide, the annihilation of an entire life world, an entire social and ecological fabric being permitted to be obliterated in sight of the entire world. We often hear that Palestinians that what is happening in Gaza and to the Palestinians is a sacrifice. But as the eminent European historian of colonial genocide Svetlana Todorov pointed out with respect to the genocides that occurred on these lands, the so-called New World, these are not sacrifices, but massacres. The difference is that while the targets of sacrifices are valued for being sacrificed and represented as serving a valuable social function, those who are targeted by massacres are killed en masse because their lives are ascribed by their colonizers absolutely no value at all. From an Islamic perspective, our central story for understanding ideas about sacrifice is that of the sacrifice by Prophet Ibrahim of his son, who we believe in our traditions was Ismail. An event that we believe as Muslims marked the end of a tradition and an ideology of human sacrifice. In that Quranic account of the sacrifice, as it is recounted to us, a key difference from the Christian account is that Ismail is a willing and knowing participant in the sacrifice. He openly offers himself for sacrifice. Something that cannot be said about the children in Gaza and the women in Gaza, the children who from the early days were writing their names on their arms and their legs in case they were so obliterated by the bombs that their body parts could not be identified for them to be inscribed on the rolls of death. The children and the families who are now just saying that instead of trying to live, they are just trying to find the place where they most prefer to die. These are not sacrifices, these are massacres. Massacres in the long colonial tradition of predicating the right for life of the colonizers upon the obligation that the colonized must die. What the eminent Australian anthropologist Hassan Haj called a long tradition of quote-unquote colonial rubbishing, the treatment of the colonized as little more than waste to be disposed of. When I was speaking of Palestine to an audience with indigenous people in Winnipeg, and we talked about the concept of colonial rubbishing, they knew right away what we were talking about, because at the time they were having to advocate to have their women who had been murdered, to have their bodies excavated from a landfill where they had been thrown like garbage and the government was refusing to search for them. And so they were forced to hold signs saying what no one should ever have to say, that a landfill is not a burial place, that women are not garbage. Partners, targets of this history of colonial rubbishing, which Palestinians are now also bearing the brunt. And yet, it is Muslims and Arabs and Iranians and Palestinians who are accused by the colonizers of having a love of death and a quote-unquote culture of death. A transparent inversion through which the responsibility for massacre is displaced back onto those who are targeted by it. As we know from eminent scholars like Talal Assad and Ali Shariati, these accusations and allegations of Muslims and Palestinians and Arabs and Iranians' culture of death is not simply an inversion, but a projection of Europe's own culture of death that has been built into its political forms of the nation-state built on genocide, its international law built to obscure genocidal violence. These are not simply inversions, but projections of Europe's own culture of death that it has institutionalized and universalized throughout the world. So Ali Shariati reminds us, for example, in response to the demonization and pathologization of our concept of martyrdom, the Islamic concept of the martyr, that while it is Europeans' idea of martyrdom that is situated within a semantic framework of death, in Islam, our idea of martyrdom is situated within a semantic framework of life, of protecting life, of bearing witness, a word that is etymologically related to the word for martyr, of bearing witness, of testifying in the face of oppression in order to create a context of life, of just and dignified and possible life for all. And it is this task of bearing witness that we see so many bravely engaged in around the world in the face of the extreme state violence deployed to suppress it. In the current project of bearing witness for Gaza, 3 primary characteristics of bearing witness are made clear to us once again. First, that the failure to bear witness by the powerful is not simply due to a passive absence of knowledge, but rather an active denialism and obfuscation and refusal of the truth. These powerful politicians and state leaders have all the same evidence that we do and more that we have been seeing streamed constantly on social media and televisions. I spoke recently to one of the lawyers who has been leading one of the cases against governmental complicity through arms sales in the genocide in Gaza. And what he told me was that this is a unique case because the problem is not a lack of evidence, but rather that there is too much evidence, that there are so many stories and accounts and statistics of horrors and atrocity that it is difficult to weave them all together into one single legal narrative. The problem is not an passive absence of information, but rather the willful, active refusal to see and acknowledge. Just earlier today, we learned that a Dutch court has refused a case brought by several human rights organizations in order to enforce a prior ban that had been ordered by the Dutch Court of Appeals against the Dutch government selling parts for F-35 fighter jets to Israel. And in refusing this, what the Dutch court said was that, well, we only said you couldn't send parts directly to Israel. We never said that you couldn't send them via other states, such as the US. Explicitly countenancing the flaunting and subversion of its own ban in the face of incontrovertible evidence of the Dutch government's continuing breach, simply in order to preserve the status quo. And as throughout the colonial world, we have seen courts, newspapers, media, universities, the very institutions that are supposed to be the producers of quote-unquote knowledge, being at the forefront of the production of the required ignorance about the genocide in Gaza and the history of anti-Palestinian deracination and immiseration that it is entrenched in. Therefore, secondly, on bearing witness, we know that for us, bearing witness then against this active production of unwitnessing, the bearing of witness is not simply correspondingly a passive act of looking, but rather an active act of testifying and advancing the conditions necessary to produce and promote life. And we are seeing this bravely in streets and university campuses around the world, people confronting harsh punishments, even giving their lives in the case of former U.S. soldier Aaron Bushnell, in order to testify and refuse to be complicit in what is happening in Gaza right now. We know from the work of scholar of Quran, Toshiko Izutsu's brilliant work, Ethical Religious Concepts in the Quran, that the opposite of jahiliyyah, ignorance, is not simply knowledge, but rather hilm, the active cultivation of a state of being that refuses one's lower impulses and instead acts to a higher standard of being. And so in confronting the mandatory and constructed ignorance, the jahiliyyah around what is happening in Gaza, it is not simply a task of marshalling knowledge against it, but rather actively creating and prefiguring the conditions for different modes of life, one in which the genocide of Palestinians is not only not permissible, but not thinkable. And so, third, in cultivating this state of hilm, we also need to think about the forms of violence that we too have been actively made to be ignorant, willfully ignorant of, including the conditions of violence that sustain our own presence on this land in the history and the face of ongoing indigenous genocide, the continuing expropriations and from indigenous land and wealth that continue to fund the genocide in Gaza as well. That is also our responsibility as Muslims on this land to address. Ayah 143 of Surah 2 in the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, tells us that as Muslims, we have been created as an upright and a just and a middle way community, and it is our task to bear witness for all communities as the Prophet is there to bear witness for us. The project, the Islamic project of bearing witness, we know began with a small group of people, those who are on the undersides of society, the dispossessed, the refugees. How many times was the Prophet made a refugee? The most marginalized and vulnerable people who, in the face of all of this power, bravely assumed the task and the trust of bearing witness. As we see millions around the streets and in universities and in every sector of life, continuing to be bravely among those who are bearing witness to the atrocities in Gaza today. With the story, with the incident, with the event of Ibrahim's stopped sacrifice of his son, this was an event that not only put an end to the ideology of human sacrifice, but also the ideology of burnt offerings, the complete immolation of that which was sacrificed as an offering to God, instead turning it into a feast to sustain and nourish and build bonds amongst the community as a whole. In other words, this was an act of transforming a culture of death into a culture that sustains life. As we continue to see Palestinians praying in their destroyed mosques, as they did at Jummah today, giving each other sustenance as they did during Ramadan, despite the conditions of starvation forced upon them. We know that this task and this trust of being people who refuse the colonial equation that says that some must die in order so that some must live, instead moving it to a new equation where we say we live in order to create the conditions where others may live as well. We know that this task and this trust of transforming and bearing witness to change a culture of death into a culture of life continues, and it will continue until Palestine, from the river to the sea and every other site of colonial atrocity, has been freed, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace and justice to you all, and thank you.